The replication of three-dimensional objects has a very long history. In fact, it is thought by many to actually predate two-dimensional reproduction by several millennia. There is a possible exception, that is the use of the human hand as used as a kind of primitive stencil, as seen in some prehistoric cave paintings. Some of the earliest examples of for molds for making objects are in fact for tools or weapons, like this Bronze Age axe mold from Spain. I'm interested in the role of three-dimensional reproduction in relation to sculptural practice as a way of trying to make some sense of our place in an increasingly technologically orientated world dependent upon items that are mass-produced for our everyday life. Examples of press molds for clay can be found globally in many ancient civilizations. This is an example from Italy from about 100 BC and from pre-Columbian South America. The Chinese terracotta army is thought to have been the result of a production line, and that within this process there were about 8 head molds, individual characteristics being added towards the end of the making process. Ex-voto images have in many cultures been produced by either the pressing or the casting of metals. They're in effect mass production processes, but they're given individual talismanic significance by whatever emotion was invested in the object when it was placed in its new location. A traditional view of a work of art is that it is a result of the hand of the artist in close communion with his material. In fact, sculptors over the centuries have employed the skills of a number of craftsmen to produce or reproduce their work. In terms of bronze, it's via a cast from an original. In terms of stone, via a process known as pointing. And now with digital technologies, there are even more ways to replicate a form. And a climate of opinion has eventually evolved over the centuries that allows some artists to become more akin to a project manager for their idea, and even possibly and just simply an instigator of an idea. An artist who used three-dimensional reproductive processes extensively is Rodin, mostly for financial or promotional means, but also as a way of fixing the fugitive qualities of clay into something more permanent like bronze. But there's one example where he used the ability to replicate a form as an expressive aesthetic device, and that is at the top of his depiction of Dante's Inferno, titled The Gates of Hell. At the top, there are the 3 shades. They are 3 identical casts of a human figure. They're pointing down to add more emphasis to the dread of the inferno below. On leaving school, my initial training was as a jig and tool designer with Rolls Royce Aerospace. That area of work is concerned with the design of the tools and the systems for the manufacturing of objects. I became less interested in the engines, but more a question of the making. That's something which kind of quite intrigued me. The following 2 images are examples of the sort of thing that would have confronted me during my time there. A jet engine compressor comprises of many very small components. They're each quite beautiful in themselves. They're small, very delicately, accurately formed, aeroform sections. But together, they make up a collective whole. I feel that objects that are severely functional have an aesthetic value of their own, like, for example, this Hercules engine with its knotted muscular power and very expressive means of joining components together. We seem to have conflicting attitudes towards industrial mass production. We're quite happy to benefit from the democratization of the objects we use in everyday life, but are quite concerned that it will homogenize or denature our environment. And so some of my work is an exploration of our rather complex relationship with this matter. For 2 months, I was an artist in residence in a scrap metal yard. It's a very potent indicator of the conduct of society. And while I was there, I became very interested in the dynamics of the waste process. And I was wondering whether it would be possible to actually manufacture things directly from the waste or the scrap raw material. It's a way of, if you like, short-circuiting the recycling loop. So instead of the scrap material being melted down, reprocessed into some base material form, we could take this secondary raw material or scrap material and manufacture something directly with it. In response to a commission for a woodland setting, I decided to make a multi-part work which would work with the landscape, with the trees, rather than try and compete with them by working vertically. I was also interested to see whether we could, if you like, take a mass production process and introduce an element of chance, a bit like throwing a virtual spanner in the works. So using these 250 copper water tanks, I evolved this following process. Firstly, the tanks were crushed in one direction by about a third. Then they were cut open and flattened by whatever technology I could find. We had quite an entertaining time trying to find various ways, including a ride-on road roller, but this was really an available technology, and so this is what we used. The result were these flattened, crumpled sheets of copper. I found through experimentation that this material could withstand the trauma of being pressed into shape. Also, copper has this magical property of work hardening. So as this material would be pressed into shape, it would also harden. So these materials were taken to an aerospace factory in the Midlands, and into a rubber press, I introduced two press tools, one for the front and one for the back of a male figure. The copper sheets were then placed on top of the press tool before sliding into the rubber press. The rubber is housed in the upper part of the press. This particular process would replicate precisely, but I frustrated it with this rather erratic material. The machines next door were making very accurate components for aircraft. This was anarchy in my particular area. The result was 40 life-size figures, arranged as if emerging out of woodlands. The rear figures are actually dissolving back into the trees. They have much the same girth and ragged profile as the ivy-covered trunks. I feel that the material and the method of construction can actually affect quite profoundly your reading of a sculptural object. And as these figures were produced by a very brusque and rough sort of manner, I thought rather than them reading singly, they ought to be read collectively. Also, it demonstrated the fact that it was the result of a production process, however anarchic. I found this image of a crowd scene, a protest meeting in Spain, and was moved by the idea of a power of a show of hands. This led me to think of other images I had of crowd scenes. Like this is a concert, a photograph of a concert. I was also intrigued by our present globalised manufacturing situation. Items now are very rarely manufactured wholly in one country. So taking my own hand as subject, I made my own hand as a subject in a neutral disposition. I made a casting pattern which would be used as a casting pattern in a Far Eastern industrial foundry. I found it very interesting and revealing, this whole process of the to and fro of samples and all the attendant paperwork, which I considered as part of the making process. So the result was an installation of 2,000 cast iron hands arranged in a kind of no-nonsense grid or rack, much the sort of thing you would see things placed in during a production process. I felt it needed a large quantity of hands to give weight physically and conceptually to the intended idea. I hoped, it's called register, and I'm hoping that it might register as a verb or as a noun. As a verb, to the act of registering an opinion or feeling; as a noun, as a physical record of a collective quantity or feeling or emotion or opinion or something like that. Since its first sighting in woodland, it's been on a journey to highly suitable sites. This is the Passage of the Lost Steps, which is rather a beautiful title in itself, but it's actually the anteroom to the Portuguese Parliament debating chamber, which is through that mahogany door you can see. From there it went on to a Roman road in a Roman archaeological site in the south of Portugal. For a long time, I'd been interested in the idea of using digital technology as a way of making sculpture. The initial stage of scanning is something called point cloud data, which is quite a poetic term in a way. I was interested in the idea that an object could exist as a cloud of points in space, as literally a cloud in space. These points in space are then meshed, that is, all the dots are joined up, and it produces a virtual surface. This virtual surface can then produce a virtual form. All sorts of ways you can use this. A common method is to divide it into thousands of horizontal slices and then instruct a machine to build that very form. My first reaction was to experiment on myself. So from a scan of my own head, a small 5 centimeter high resin build was made. There's something extraordinarily humbling about seeing yourself diminished to this scale, rather like the sensation of confronting a sublime and beautiful and vast landscape. Say, for example, your first encounter with the Grand Canyon just reinforces just how small you are within a global context. From this, I made a wax injection mold for use in a precision foundry. And so the result is a cloud of steel heads fixed to the wall, if you like, my head in the clouds. Each head is fixed to the wall at a slightly different angle. The angle or disposition of a head can signify a whole range of emotions, maybe best illustrated by mask theatre. Although the mask has a fixed expression, the way in which the actor manipulates that can convey all manner of different emotions. When working with the forming of metal into molds, I became quite intrigued by the molds themselves. They represent an absence. And they represent this sort of absence, but they're really a defined space. So the subject has become a space, and the space around the subject has then been given form, that is the mold. So it gave rise to a whole series of works, this being one of them. It's entitled Janus Head, and it consists of 2 11-foot-high cast iron forms. Cast iron, or this is sand cast iron, is a very long-standing foundry tradition, largely associated with our heavy industrial past. I really wanted to make something which expressed the technology of our time. And so the opportunity to go to Korea and use the facilities of a town famous for shipbuilding and the production of stainless steel eventually made this possible. So I made this following model as a way of exploring the idea of a walk-through head-like space. So the interior of the form is actually the subject, the head. The exterior, which is more generalized, is the result of the wall thickness. From this, we then made another model to trial the intended constructional process. This is made by three-dimensional printing. The idea was to take a quarter section of a strongly featured male head and then to make an interpretation on a computer which reduces it down to a series of horizontal profiles exterior to the head. So the subject is the interior surface, the exterior is the result of the wall thickness, and any attendant ribs which are necessary or deemed structurally necessary was accepted as an expression of the process of construction. This was then tested by making a small-scale model. Then these are the laser-cut profiles. And mercifully, as the machine cuts them out, it numbers each one. These were then slotted into vertical ribs. The resulting work had a degree of transparency a bit greater than I had thought, which enables the piece to actually take in and become part of the landscape and be more than usually affected by lighting conditions. I feel that there's an area of tension between the image of the human image and the physicality of materials and process. And I find this whole area very rich with association, and it's what I rather intuitively explore. Artists of each era have been curious about and have used the technologies of their time. These are some of my attempts to make something that reflects both my time and my experience. Thank you.